Once again, I will present you with a few verses from the Quran to substantiate a understanding, a particular meaning, and that understanding we will then go on to apply. So I'm going to continue where we left off last week. Last week, we had a discussion about what is knowledge. In other words, who is right, for the past 2 weeks. And what we spoke about was that knowledge has a theory from the Quran. The Quran does advance a theory of knowledge. And the theory of knowledge that the Quran advances is essentially based on the fact that any statement or any claim to truth must be substantiated by means of a proof or by means of solid evidence. And so I went through the types of evidence, and evidence includes rational reasoning, etc., etc. And so I'm not going to go through all of those again. So let me just proceed with what I want to cover this evening. The question I want to ask this evening is, how do we verify knowledge? And I'm going to present to you for a few moments, for maybe 30 minutes or so. And then we will go into a discussion. So let me just get the screen right. Okay, there we go. How to verify knowledge. You know, let me just again contextualize what we are discussing here and why we are doing this. We're not doing this to have an intellectual session here, because I mean, intellectualism doesn't produce anything in the real world. So what we're doing is we're trying to find a way to read the map of life. You know, when you try and navigate through this world, you, your family, your wife, your children, and to the wives, their husbands, it's essential that we know how to read the map. How do you apply your mind, and how do you use the tools that Almighty Allah has provided for you? Now, Allah mentions in the Quran the most important tool, the most important means of guidance is the book of Allah, is the Testament, is the Holy Quran. And but there are other means of guidance, such as, for example, the signs in nature, such as, for example, your rational mind. You know, and these things are all tools that we can use to navigate. And if you don't know how to navigate, you will become very frustrated and very confused, because the charlatans and the false prophets and, you know, the con artists will all make a claim to truth, and you will find yourself sort of in a difficult place trying to make sense of all the competing claims to truth. So what we're doing here is I'm offering myself and you a means of navigating to see what is real and what is not real. And so the discussion continues now. The question now that I want to ask is how to verify knowledge. And I'm going to draw from the Quran itself 5 means that the Quran offers you and me to verify any claim to knowledge. First of all, the Quran does regard the character of the claimant as relevant. So you cannot say that it doesn't matter who said it. It does matter who comes up with a claim or with a story or with knowledge or with a legal position or with a rule or with a policy. It does matter the character of the claimant. Now I want to show you the proof. The Quran says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu in ja'akum fasiqun bin naba'in fatabayyanu an tusibu qawman bijahalatin fatusbihu ala ma fa'altum nadimin. Tusibu qawman bijahalatin fatusbihu ala ma fa'altum nadimin. Tusbihu, sorry, right? Meaning, oh, you believe, if a wicked person comes to you with any news, ascertain the truth, lest you harm people unwittingly. I go back to the first point here. The character of the claimant is important. Doesn't mean the character that you are going to say what this person said is a lie. You don't have, but you need to verify. So you need to find corroboration. If an evil or a wicked or a transgressive individual or an immoral individual comes to you with a claim, you need to ascertain. The Quran says, fatabayyanu, ascertain, corroborate, find proof, additional proof. Do not take his word for it. So that is the first point that the Quran raises. And it's very practical, it's a very practical thing. Often you get people, the current news media, they don't belong to an angel species. They belong to the elite. And the elite is there to exploit and to increase their own wealth and not to spread truth. And if they could turn human beings into a bunch of savages, and that would be more profits for them, then so we have to ascertain. So first of all, I want to say to you, gone are the days when you can look at CNN and BBC and say, look, yeah, I heard it on there, that means it's true. No, it's not. We can't go on that. We have to corroborate. You have to find an alternative means to corroborate that. Number two, how to verify knowledge is there has to be an absence of discrepancies in the material. So the material itself will expose its own weakness. I'm not going to go much into that, but let me take an example from Quran where Allah says, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ وَلَوْ كَانَ مِنْ عِنْدِ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ لَوَجَدُوا فِيهَا اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا. Do they not consider the Quran? Had it been from other than Allah, they would surely have found therein much discrepancy. Which means, if you look at the overall logic of that verse, it says that it does refer to the Quran as free of discrepancies, but it also basically, the broader lesson that you can draw from that verse is that anything that is not divine, that is not sound, that is not coherent, will reveal discrepancies. So when you look at material, when somebody makes a claim, but that claim makes opposing claims in various parts of the same document or the same treatise or the same literature, then you must know that's a false literature. Now, I know that there's been much work done on the New Testament and the Old Testament, where even Bible scholars have uncovered thousands of discrepancies, where numbers are out. You know, there's some books written about it. Bart Ehrman, I think he's the most famous Bible scholar that has unearthed tens of thousands of discrepancies in the Bible. And so we're not saying the Bible is false, but we are saying that it is not an unquestionable source of knowledge. Discrepancies is a method of uncovering an unreliable claim. The other point is absence of intellectual schism. So when a body of literature, material, knowledge is causing schisma or opposing schools of thought, or opposing viewpoints, then that is a sure sign that there's a problem. Let me take an example here. Here's a verse from the Quran. وَآتَيْنَاهُمْ بَيِّنَاتٍ مِنَ الْأَمْرِ فَمَا اخْتَلَفُوا إِلَّا مِنْ بَعْدِ مَا جَاءَهُمْ الْعِلْمُ بَغْيًا بَيْنَهُمْ إِنَّ رَبَّكَ يَقْضِي بَيْنَهُمْ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ فِيمَا كَانُوا فِيهِ يَخْتَلِفُونَ. And we granted them clear signs in affairs of religion. It was only after knowledge had been granted to them that they fell into schisms through insolent envy amongst themselves. I'll read up to that point. But the fact Allah has given guidance, and Allah states that it is only after He's given guidance that they fell into schisms due to their own envy and personal weaknesses. Next point is social discord and upheaval. Now, that is another sure sign, is where people are following a text or a body of knowledge or a body of law. Remember, it all falls under the category of knowledge. Knowledge is science, knowledge is law, knowledge is the way people behave, the code that people live according to, the values. That is the knowledge that people operate according to. And if that body of understanding that people operate according to is causing social discord, then that is another sign that there's a problem. The verse of the ayat says, ذَلِكَ بِأَنَّ اللَّهَ نَزَّلَ الْكِتَابَ بِالْحَقِّ وَإِنَّ الَّذِينَ اخْتَلَفُوا فِي الْكِتَابِ لَفِي شِقَاقٍ بَعِيدٍ. This is so because Allah revealed the law rightfully. So those who dispute about the law are a broken off splinter far away. Truth cannot admit or result in discord. There is one truth. There is one body of knowledge. It is a coherent, unified body of knowledge. And there cannot be social discord if people follow the divine, unified body of knowledge as is created by Almighty Allah. So when there's dispute, when there's upheaval, when there's revolution, when there is insurrection, go and look and find where the divine truth has been violated. Next point is natural appeal, finally. I want to add this one also, is that truth has a natural affinity to the hearts of ordinary human beings. There is a natural inclination that we have towards truth. Why? It says here, La ikraha fi din. Allah says, La ikraha fi din. Qad tabayyana rushdu min al-ghayy. There is no compulsion in the deen, religion, deen, life choice. Right has been contrasted from error. So clearly, Allah is telling us that you will have a natural propensity for distinguishing right from wrong. You have an inbuilt natural propensity. I add that in, although it's not always reliable, it is something that we can rely on. If it smells bad, it probably is bad. You know, the old thing about poisonous food or rotten food tastes bad, because it was built into our senses that you wouldn't eat rotten food. It doesn't feel right. It doesn't smell right. And the same with knowledge. When somebody comes to you with a pack of nonsense, lies and concoctions, you will smell it smells bad, but it's not a foolproof method. I'm just adding it in. So alhamdulillah, what we what we have there is a set of tests for what we regard as truth. And now let us apply this, because I want us to, for the second half of this evening's discussion, I want to apply these tests. You know what? These tests are there so that we can navigate and realize what is bunk, bunk nonsense, and what is real and true. So I want to take the discussion a bit forward and introduce another topic, but a case study actually. I want to study the science of Hadith as a body of literature, as a body of knowledge, as a body of truth, of claim to truth. And let us do that. Let us look at Hadith as a source of knowledge. And I want to tonight spend a few minutes to reintroduce you to Hadith. It's a very, very, very important aspect of Islam, of the Muslims' understanding of Islam. And, I learned Hadith from a very prominent scholar, unfortunately passed away recently, but a prominent scholar in Egypt. I spent many, many hours with him trying to understand the science of Hadith. And these are just some broad ideas that I want to share with you on Hadith to introduce you, because you know what? You've got a long life, some of you still ahead of you, and you're going to have to encounter decisions, and it will be important for you. Otherwise, I would not have even gone into this topic. But let me introduce you a little bit to Hadith. First of all, I want to ask just 4 questions tonight. What is Hadith? What are the origins? What is its importance? And is Hadith literature an infallible source of knowledge? Just those 4 questions I want to ask. First of all, what is Hadith? Just make this a bit bigger. First of all, Hadith is defined formally as the utterances, the actions, and the acquiescence of the Prophet Muhammad. Believe it or not, that word acquiescence is the correct word. It is the things which the Prophet silently approved of, without saying, I agree or I don't agree. But it happened in his presence, and it didn't elicit a response. So the utterances, the actions, and the acquiescences of the Prophet Muhammad, those are defined as hadiths. So any hadith could say that I saw the Prophet, washing his hands when he came from the bathroom. And that would be a hadith. And then another person would say, I saw the Prophet, his wife was looking at the singing show, and he didn't actually pass any negative comments. So that would be a hadith. Or hadith would be the Prophet, used to enter the bathroom with his left foot. And that's an action. So utterances, actions, and acquiescences of the Prophet Muhammad would be regarded as hadiths. Secondly, part of the science of hadith is each hadith has a content part, and each hadith must have a chain of transmission. that means not only will the hadith say, like the Prophet used to wash his hands, but the hadith must include an initial part that says, narrated from Abu Huraira, who told it to, this guy, and told it to that person, and told it to that person, and then you have 4, 5, 6 people down the chain. And then the last person in the chain is the person that actually writes the book, like Bukhari. So between Bukhari and the Prophet, Bukhari is like the most famous hadith book. There's about maybe 3,000-4,000 hadiths in. But between Bukhari and the person who saw the Prophet is normally 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people. Normally like that, mostly more than 4, maybe 5 or so, 6, 7. So Bukhari would collect the hadith from somebody who says that I heard it from my father, who heard it from his father. And so the book of Bukhari contains about 3,000, maybe 4,000, not 100% sure now, of these hadiths, which have a content part and a chain of transmission. A healthy Sunni hadith has an unbroken chain all the way to the Prophet. So when Bukhari wrote it down, he wrote it from a guy who definitely speaks from another man to another man, and it leads all the way back to the Prophet. That is an unbroken chain. If the hadith has a broken chain, in other words, I narrate from my grandfather, let's say I narrate from my grandfather, right? But now I didn't live in the time of my grandfather, but I say my grandfather used to say. Then if people do a bit of research, they'll find out, but look, Anwar never knew his grandfather, so he was born 20 years after his grandfather. So this is a broken hadith. He couldn't have spoken. There's somebody in between and we don't know who it is. So an unbroken hadith is where all the narrators had contact with each other. Shia hadith, again, go back to the Prophet Muhammad and to the Imams. So that gives you an idea of what is a hadith. There are many hadiths. Let me show you. Look at all these hadiths. There's the 6 years, Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, Nasai, Ibn Majah. Those are the 6 top ones. But there are more. Other primary collections which are often used in the knowledge, in the constructing of knowledge. There's these here also. Goes up to 34. So there's 6 plus 34. Plus the secondary books of hadith, 1 to 17. So all of those are there. Then these are the Shia collections. So all of these secondary books of. So there's many books of hadith. And so, like I said to you, let me take an example of Bukhari. Bukhari visited people, asked them, do you know any hadiths? He came there 250 years later when the Prophet was passed away, 250 years. And he then, collected from that person, who collected from another person, etc., etc. Let me just continue this discussion quickly. Where are we? All right, next slide. The origins of hadith. The 6 primary hadith compilers lived between 200 and 300 years after the Prophet. There are more than 28 compilations, I just showed you now. And how these hadith compilations came about is that, during the time of the Abbasid kings, they tried to make sense. There were so many millions or hundreds of thousands of people claiming that the Prophet said so and the Prophet said so, and and obviously there were tens and hundreds of thousands of false claims to the Prophet. And, you know, a sheikh in Egypt told me this story one day that he was, you know, there was this in this period of like in this 200, 300 years that I'm referring to now, an imam was making a khutbah. And when he was done with the khutbah, he descended from the pulpit and he went to the market and he saw there was this one merchant who was selling onions. But these onions were a slightly different color from the other onions. And so it didn't sell that well. It actually didn't sell at all. And he inquired from this man who's selling the onions. And the man was from a town called Akka. And he asked this gentleman, listen, what's happening with your onions? And he said, look, people are not used to this onions. And so that's why my onions aren't selling. But, you know, I'm a good person, but it's not selling. So this imam, this Maulana, he said, look, come next week again and we'll try and help you. And so the next Friday, the man from Akka was back with his onions, but he was in the mosque listening to the sermon. And the Maulana was making the sermon. And in the sermon, the Maulana included a hadith wherein he says, Qala Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Man akala basal akka dakhala jannah. And he said to the Jamaat presence there, you know, I heard a hadith narrated from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam that whosoever eats the onions of akka will enter Jannat. And as the people went out of the mosque, immediately they all set upon the man from Akka's onion stall, and he sold out all his onions. And he thanked the Maulana for doing him the favor. So I'm sharing this story with you for one reason, and that is that creation of hadith were done for all reasons. It wasn't always just evil people. It was sometimes good people who thought they're doing somebody a favor. And there are thousands of false hadith. In fact, when Bukhari decided, Bukhari was an Iranian guy, and when he decided that he's going to compile hadith to make some sense of the chaos, apparently he collected more than 100,000 hadiths. He traveled to all the main centers of the known Muslim world, to the four corners of the Muslim world, to find people who were in possession of a little book where they wrote down some hadiths. And he would visit these people and he would knock on the door and ask them, listen, I heard you had some hadiths here that you've collected over the years. And the grand old man, whoever, will say, yes, this is what my grandfather left me. And he says these 5 hadiths he heard from his grandfather, and it goes back to... And Bukhari compiled about 100,000 or more of these little musnads. They call it a musnad, or a little compilation of hadiths. It's just a collection of hadiths. It's not, you know, it's just somebody's collection. And he then compiled all of these, let's say 100,000, and sifted through them and decided, listen, this one is in, this one is out, this one is in, this one is out. And he eventually discarded about 95% of what he collected. So about 95% of what he collected, he found to be unreliable, weak, you know, broken transmission, that it didn't go back to the Prophet. You know, he was especially focused on the chain of transmission. I will be wrapping up soon and opening up for discussion. So that is how, you know, I'm giving you an example of one, what we call muhaddith, called Bukhari. But there were others. Muslim is also a muhaddith, and there are 4 others that are considered the top grade muhaddithin. So they concentrated on the sanad, on the chain of transmission. A criticism of the hadith compilers of the Muslim, of these muhaddithin, is that they concentrated on the chain of transmission and not on the text, on the main part. What did I call it? The content part. So maybe they should have concentrated more on the content part and not just on the chain. But anyway, we'll leave that discussion for later. I just want to throw in one last point here about the origins of hadith. There's a similar understanding in Talmudic Judaism, a concept called the Mishnah. And the Mishnah goes over and above the Torah or the holy text, the Torah. Now the Mishnah is explained. Assalamu alaikum, is explained as an additional explanation or context to the text, to the Torah. And the Mishnah consists of the practices, of the doings, of the life of the Nabi Musa. And it actually is used to explain the Torah. So the Mishnah or the Talmud is a book that is much more extensive than the Torah. It is 10 times bigger than the Torah, but it is there to explain the Torah. So Mishnah and Sunnah, there are some similarities. So it's both. The Mishnah is called an oral tradition. It is not a written tradition. Next question I want to address is the importance of hadith. Hadith is regarded as an undeniable and compulsory context from which to view the Holy Quran. Today, or since hadith came about 200 to 300 years after the Prophet, it gradually became an undeniable and compulsory context from which to view the Holy Quran. In fact, now it would be almost impossible, or it would be tantamount to blasphemy to say that the hadith doesn't have a place. So it is an inextricable part of Muslims' understanding of their religion. In fact, the entirety of Muslim understanding of Salah, there's no Salah in the Quran. There's no place that it says 5 Salahs. There's no place that it says this is the way you make Salah. Nothing. So it's all from hadith. Practices like stoning of the adulterer and the adulteress is only in the hadith, not in the Quran. The death penalty for apostasy is only in the hadith, not in the Quran. So these are very critical, important practices within the Muslim understanding that don't have roots in the Quran, but that actually have roots in the hadith. In fact, by far, the majority of fiqh is derived from hadith. So I'm just highlighting to you the importance that hadith plays today. Now we come to the question of tonight. Is hadith an infallible body of knowledge? Because earlier on, I showed you this slide and I said to you how to verify knowledge. We started out by looking at this slide, right? And I said to you, any person that walks up to you and gives you a school of thought or a literature or a library or a philosophy or a treatise or a claim of any magnitude, extensive or simple, whether it's a elaborate claim or whether it's a simple claim. If somebody comes to you with an idea of reincarnation, it's a concept, right? He comes to you and he brings you a whole explanation of what is reincarnation. So you need to put it to the test. And earlier, when we started out tonight, I said to you, there has to be a few tests. And those tests are the character of the claimant, absence of discrepancies, and so forth and so forth. Now I'm going to apply this on hadith to end us off tonight. This is my final slide. First of all, the hadith, the character of the claimants. Can we trust the character of all the claimants? Now, first of all, it depends who you talk about. If you're talking about Shia hadith, then the Sunnis will say, no, those are all a bunch of scoundrels. You can't believe a word. They say Kulaini is a liar. All of them, half of them are just liars. So they will disavow the Shia hadith. You ask the Shia about the Sunni hadith, they will say, no, Abu Hurairah is a scoundrel. You know what? He actually was working for the Umayyads. He used to get paid. He was on the payroll of the Umayyads, who were a corrupt dynasty, evil empire. And so he was on the payroll. And, they will even point to hadiths where Sayyidatina Aisha says, no, he sometimes he listened poorly, he gave the wrong, he heard wrong, and then he gave the wrong. I'm not going to go into that here, but what I'm saying is that the character of the claimant is very important. And that is why in Sunni hadith, they have what is called a science of the characters of all the narrators. It is called Ilmul Rijal. And it is a science. It's obviously not an exact science, it's more of an art than a science, where they study every person and how truthful that person was. But you know what? People change. If a person is truthful, it doesn't mean he's always truthful. How accurate can it be? Some of these people were at war with Sayyidina Ali, or with some of them were regarded as munafiqeen. The Quran does mention that there are Muslims who are not really Muslim, they are munafiqeen. What if some of them gave hadith? Can we trust their hadith? There's a Jewish fellow called Ka'b al-Akhbar, who was a rabbi who adopted Islam from Yemen. And he gave some hadiths. He's a rawi. He's a guy who came up with hadiths of the Prophet. How are we to say that, he's trustworthy? And so the character of the claimant, it doesn't, for both sides, it doesn't pass the test. Because from the one perspective, it says like those people who are in the camp of the oppressor, how can they give good hadiths if they're on the side of the oppressor? So that is one thing you must consider. The second point is absence of discrepancies in the material. I can tell you today that the hadith, if you do a meticulous study of the hadith, then you will find discrepancies. It's impossible not to find discrepancies. There's one famous hadith that is claimed to be the strongest hadith in all of hadith books. It is the hadith of Khadir, Khum, Khadir. And this is the time of Khadir now. And this hadith is a hadith where the Prophet spoke to a multitude of people. And he announced that, I'm speaking under correction, there's a hadith where Allah says that the hadith of the Tariq, Inni Tariq fikum athaqalain, I leave amongst you the two heavyweights, the Kitab of Allah and the Ahlul Bayt. That hadith was attended and witnessed by apparently thousands of people, but even that hadith, there's no unity on it. The one half of the Ummah says, no, the hadith actually means I leave my sunnah and the Quran. And other people say, I leave my family and the Quran. I'm saying to you, there is discrepancy there because sunnah is not the same as family. You cannot say that's the same thing. It's a discrepancy. It's the hadith are claiming two different wordings to the same event. It's a discrepancy in the books. Now, what do we follow, the Sunnah or the Ahlul Bayt? And so therefore you have a massive division because that hadith is ambiguous. And so again, the absence of discrepancy, the material does not pass it. And that is just one example. There are numerous other examples. I have a book that I wrote that I listed a bunch of these discrepancies. You can find it on the internet. The absence of intellectual schism, social discord, and natural appeal. Now, there are some hadiths that says that, some of the Sahaba used to drink the pee of the Prophet or something. And it does not have natural appeal. There's this one hadith that says that the Prophet once told a guy of 17 years old that he must be breastfed by a woman in order for this woman to become his mahram. A guy of 17, 18 years old must breastfeed from a woman. It does not pass the smell test. It does not pass the smell test. And I said to you earlier, if it doesn't smell right, it probably isn't good, right for you. You won't eat rotten food. So will you believe a story that tells you that? So what I'm saying to you is that, is hadith an infallible body of knowledge? Definitely not an infallible body of knowledge. It is a body of literature, yes, and it is a body of literature that we can possibly benefit from. It's got historical value. It has got a lot of value. I am not one of those people that said you must burn any books. But what I'm saying is that we should develop a healthy, critical approach to it. Do not think because it's a Shia hadith, it's nonsense, and do not think because it's a Sunni hadith, it's nonsense, but let us apply our critical, rational faculties when any hadith comes our way. There's this famous hadith where the Prophet is reported to have said, Al-Jannatu tahta aqdam al-ummahat. Paradise lies at the feet of the mother. You know what? For me, that hadith, it resonates with me. It resonates with the Quran. It resonates with the beautiful respect within society that must be there for the mother. I embrace that hadith. Not because it's in Bukhari, but because it is in harmony. And so that is how I view hadith. Not as nonsense, but also not as people say, next to the word of Allah. Subhanallah, you can't say that. It's not next to the word of Allah. So I will sort of stop at that point and then open up. We have a few minutes left. Please feel free to add discussion. You don't have to ask me questions. You can just add, or you can just have an opposing view. I wouldn't mind that. It will go out and let's put it on. Okay. So I think there's a question in the chat. I'm not here to shoot down the hadith. I'm just saying, let us take a healthy attitude. What about the hadith of Sayyidina Aisha who lived with the Prophet? Wouldn't that be the most accurate? Yeah, look, like I said, the hadiths of all the Sahabas, of any person, is valuable to be scrutinized and to be studied. But can you claim that anything that Sayyidatina Aisha said must become divine law? No. I cannot say that what a person who came after the Prophet, who is, whatever that person's words are, can be regarded as tantamount to the words of the Quran. So I certainly respect it. It makes sense. The person who lived with the Nabi would have seen a lot more, would have been very close to the Prophet ﷺ. And there are many hadiths. Sayyidatina Aisha is the second most popular narrator of hadith after Abu Huraira. I think Abu Huraira is the biggest, 4,000 or 5,000. Sayyidatina Aisha is like 4,000 or 5,000 also. So a lot of hadith by Sayyidina Aisha. But do remember that many people, you are not reading Sayyidatina Aisha's words when you read a hadith in Bukhari. You're reading somebody who quotes from Sayyidina Aisha, and not just that person, a person who quotes from that person. So you are looking at 5 people down the line. So it's not Muzammil's words, it's Muzammil's sons, cousins, grandsons, nephew, and it goes 5 stops before it gets to Muzammil. So you cannot say necessarily when a hadith is claimed or attributed to Sayyidatina Aisha, that it is words. Remember, a lot of people use sahabis to fabricate hadith. But shukran for the question. I'm not saying that you throw Abu Huraira or you throw Aisha away, but develop a critical stance. Look at it fresh. Look at it with a rational mind. And if you see something that doesn't look right, it's probably you need to investigate it.
Assalamu alaikum, Zainab speaking.
Salam. Bismillah.
I was just curious about why hadith that are clearly inconsistent with the Quran are still retained as part of the hadith tradition. Like the obvious example I can think of is punishment for adultery. There couldn't be a clearer discrepancy between what is recommended in the Quran as punishment and what is set out as supposedly the punishment of stoning. So if like there's such a clear-cut example there, and supposedly the Prophet himself said, if there's anything that I practice that is or that I say that is inconsistent with the Quran, follow the Quran. And couldn't you like why haven't those clear inconsistencies been removed from the hadith? Because it does like reduce the value of other hadith that could be valid, or that could be not necessarily what the Prophet said, but it is consistent with the spirit of Islam, like that said about the Jannah being beneath the feet of mothers, for instance. Shukran.
Yeah. Zainab, you're asking me why is that not expelled or eliminated from the body of knowledge?
Well, that's like a very obvious discrepancy. It's not like a matter of opinion.
Look, there's a very strong movement. All I can say is there's a very strong movement. You know, after ISIS shocked the Muslim world. ISIS shocked the entire Muslim world, not just the Shia Muslims, but even the Sunni world was shocked by ISIS. Why? Because ISIS meticulously decided to implement every hadith in their Islamic state. And so when they found a hadith that says that the apostates must be killed, they then they connected the dots and said, look, the Yazidis are apostates, or the Shias are apostates, and so they must all be killed, you know. Or where they found a hadith that says the person who's involved in sodomy or gay, he must be thrown off a building, killed like that. Then they strictly went according to that hadith. And there's a current movement in the world. I don't know if you saw the video of this prince of Saudi Arabia. But what I'm saying to you is that the Muslim world is still sitting with the shock of ISIS and how ISIS used the text, the hadith text especially, to impose a barbaric system. And so I can tell you something that many of the prominent scholars that I've been following have clearly taken a much more critical stance towards hadith, and they are more critical now than ever before. I will predict, you know, from my angle that I'm looking at things, that within the next 10 to 20 years, these abominable practices like stoning of women, it will probably be something of the past. And I think it will be, we are seeing major changes taking place in the Muslim world. And I predict that some of these things are going to be removed from the body of Islam.
Okay, shukran.
Afwan.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Salam to everybody here. I have a question just regarding the way that the message was passed on. So I think Daddy mentioned the hadith were really compiled about 300, 400 years after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Why was it not at the time seen significant enough to actually write it down? Because there's many other civilizations many years before that time that actually recorded history in the stone or on parchments or on paper, and they've obviously got a more accurate record of that period, but yet we have this chain of narration that we depend on. I know the same can be said for the Quran, because the Quran was also put into writing many years after. But why was that the case? Was that just a cultural state of the Saudis, or was there a reason that they felt that the verbal or the memorization was much better than actually writing it down? Shukran.
Yeah, there was no practice of writing down hadith in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. In fact, it was discouraged. There are hadiths that actually state that the Prophet used to stop people from writing down hadiths or words that he was just talking informally. And if you think about it, there's very good reason for that. You know, the Quran was revealed over the 23 years that the Prophet was on earth. And to draw a very clear line between what is actual wahi, text from the Quran, text from Allah, and his own words, he only instructed people to record in writing the wahi. So the hadith became an oral thing. And it became an abused oral tradition. Like I said, Bukhari had to deal with 100,000 hadiths. And your question is, why was it not recorded? The Prophet discouraged it. The reason, it might have caused confusion with the Quran. Now, the question that I just want to add something. If somebody wants to ask a question, just jump in. But I just want to add something here. So what about somebody who says to you, yeah, but you know what, if you say hadith is a problem, then what about Quran? Because the same people that transmitted the hadith are the people that had to transmit the Quran. Now the difference, of course, is the Quran there were scribes. They were actual recorders. There were people who were actually recording the Quran all the time. So when the Prophet would receive a wahi, immediately he would instruct his scribes to bring a parchment and to record the following words, and he would dictate the exact wording, even to the spelling, to these people. So the Prophet was not illiterate. If you want to say the Prophet is literate, that's your belief, but how can you verify the text if you don't know what is alif and a ba? How can you insult my Prophet who say, I can read alif ba, but the Prophet couldn't read alif ba? The Prophet could read. He was a literate man. He was unlettered in the sense that he was unschooled. He was unoriented by a formal schooling system. So he was a free thinker in that sense, but he was literate. He was uninfluenced. So Harun, the thing is, Quran was written down. You cannot say that Quran suffers the same problem of hadith, because Quran, every verse was written down, not by one. Remember, each verse of the Quran doesn't go back to one person. It doesn't go back to Abu Huraira. It goes back to multiple people. So there were numerous Sahabas that gave each verse of the Quran and vouched for each verse of the Quran. So the Quran is solid all the way back up to the Prophet in a written record as well as in a memorized form. There's a big difference. And of course, the Quran passes all those tests of discrepancy and, that long list there. Okay, so if I don't have any other questions, then I'm fine with signing off. I hear somebody coming up.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Bismillah. As not a question, maybe again observation from my side. I just think at this time, in our lives, it's very difficult for us to have leaders that we also can follow, like the Sahaba had a Nabi, and they could follow him, and he was the guidance. Like you say, with the hadiths, how the hadith, that chain reaction with the hadiths, coming from Sayyidina Aisha till the cousin, whoever. Yeah, so for us, it's very difficult to find leaders that we really can follow and say, okay, this is our leader, this is the ulama or the sheikh that we, that we can follow. Yeah, so for us, it's not easy at the moment.
Yeah,
to find that. Yeah,
it's true. It is true. It's a difficult time. We have to unfortunately depend on our sometimes on ourselves now. So you have to, if you have a family, you're bringing up children, you don't have a choice. You need to keep food on the table. You don't have a choice but to find your way. You can't go and say, look, I throw my hands up in the air and I give up. I don't know what to do. So unfortunately, I would say yes, even in a time of great confusion, I think what we're doing is, the few of us that's sitting here tonight, whether we're 20 or 25, right here by me, there's 5 of us here, and whoever is out there, I think what we are doing is we're doing the next best thing. We're sitting together and we're trying to make sense of it. What you shouldn't do is to go and latch yourself onto the nearest guy that comes to you with a brilliant idea, and he fools you and he takes you on a trip with him, some wild ideas. Because then how can you then stop your kids? I have so many friends that when they went to university with me, we went in, we were all from Paarl, we were all from the small towns, we were all going to the same mosque. And some of them were not Muslim, so they were from the same high school and so on. But after 3 years at university, some of them became, nihilists, atheists. Some of them became complete, misfits or drunkards and whatever. Some of them became tablighs. Some of them became Western secular intellectuals. And so if we don't have a blueprint, if we don't have some clear navigation, some clear map, then you will definitely see your kids scattering into different directions. You will have 5 children, and each one of those 5 will become some different extreme that you will be abhorred by. I know people, the kids went and got married in a church, in our own family. I mean, the kids became atheists, the kids became anti-Islam. So I'm saying to you, Kamil, we have to have some sort of rein, some sort of thing to tie it up and to keep it real, to make sense of it. Otherwise, the one person will become a tabligh, the other one will become an atheist, the other one will become a modernist, the other one will become LGBT activist. And that's because we're throwing our hands up and saying, there's so much confusion, just let it be. So I think your point is not that, I hope. Your point is that we just have a tougher job. We cannot give up and say, look, here, follow the Maulana that's nearest to you. But that's why we're here. We are here to try to make sense. That's why I'm here. I need you to help me because I have ideas and maybe I've got it all wrong. Anything else? Bismillah.
Yeah, I actually just want to add on to Samuel's thing. I think the best is just to say what makes sense from whatever leader you hear things from. Some things will become clearer because some things, that's where the things that are really make sense to us. We should also rely on our common sense as well.
Shukran for that, Shaista makes a lot of that. That is a good contribution. Yes?
Hello, Salah.
Turn the volume down quickly when you're speaking. The TV volume when you're speaking.
Yes, it's down now.
Okay.
Is it, can you hear me now?
That's good. That's good.
Okay, thank you. You know, I think what is important here is that when we see the various interpretations that we can draw from Hadith, I think what is important for us is that we must respect that people have different opinions of interpretations, not only about the Quran, but because there are so many Hadith and there are so many perspectives of a particular event, we must understand that our fellow Muslim brother or sister has a particular opinion, and just live in peace with people in that way. It's a very difficult situation today where people lobby within camps and they side with a particular camp because that camp has a specific way of thinking. So we have to be free thinkers, you know. We have to follow actually the way of the Nabi, who was uninfluenced and untainted, and who was, for that matter, he was called an unlettered person. Maybe that is the example that we need to take from him. Let's have untainted hearts and let's look for the truth and let that truth resonate with our hearts. I think that is my contribution there.
Shukran, that's a very good point, Farooq. You know, Farooq, maybe that is actually at the root of what we're doing here, is that I'm trying to take away the extreme attachment that people have to certain things by saying that let us be that strong only about the Quran. But if somebody wants to sing and dance and have a Sufi joke and make their dhikr in that way, tafaddal. If somebody wants to beat his chest and say, this is the way I celebrate, you know, Karbala or commemorate, tafaddal. If somebody makes Salah with his arms on his side and the next guy wants to keep his arms wherever, tafaddal. I'm here saying to you that we should stop regarding all of these practices as divine, because the only thing that's divine is the book of Allah. There's no other book of Allah except the Quran, and that is the book that you cannot compromise on. If that book says that Allah is at war with the person who extracts riba from people and causes poverty and hardship, then we must be at war with that person. You cannot say no, but you know what, we are at peace with the guys who are extracting interest out of the poor and causing hardship in society. You know, so I'm with you, Farooq, actually, that I'm trying also to get to the point where we'll stop, because remember, most of the extremism is people who cling to a hadith or to a sheikh or to a maulana who says that, listen, you must keep your finger and your hand and your head and your toe like this in the salah, and then he condemns you if you don't do it that way. Inshallah, shukran. Let us take that. You know, that is at least how I view your contribution. Any other questions? Not so? Then I thank you all for attending. For those who have made a contributions, much appreciated. It does add a lot of value, and also it tests the rest of us. You know, if you have a viewpoint, then it makes us also think, and then we can revise our own ideas. Nobody is free of mistakes, least of all me. And so what I do is I present you with some ideas. I take it from the Quran, but I welcome the comments. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.